The reason you want to sanction the oligarchs is because you want to sanction Putin. How does it affect his behavior? It means that he has less access to capital for whatever nefarious purposes he wants to use it for. And so it's truly important that everyone understands that. This is not just, it's not like, some kind of, populist exercise to go after rich people. It's an exercise to go after the most significant people who look after Putin's money and who are integral to the whole fabric of decision-making in the Russian government.
Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Browder, once Russia's biggest foreign investor and now one of the most vocal campaigners against Russian corruption, to talk about the UK's attempts to impose financial sanctions. This is a UK political podcast, so we're going to talk mainly about the UK's role. I wonder how you've found the sanctions that the UK government has been trying to introduce so far. What do you make of them?
Well, it started in a pretty pathetic way when the very first sanctions were announced. There were, I think, 4 oligarchs most of whom had been sanctioned. I think all of whom had been sanctioned before by the U.S. and a few banks. I think that was the first Tuesday after the invasion, and then they ratcheted it up to Gazprom Bank and Spare Bank and BTB Bank and a few more oligarchs, and so it's starting to look strong. But I would argue that we're in a moment of true existential risk, and sanctioning a dozen oligarchs doesn't do the trick. If we need to do this properly, we need to sanction 100 oligarchs. And I'm not sure whether there is the ability or political will to do that. And I think that's the necessary next step if we want to contain Vladimir Putin.
Well, you're sort of the godfather of sanctions, are you, with the Magnitsky Act and taking it worldwide? I mean, is it too little, too late now, the sanctions that we introduce, even if we go further, as you've just outlined? There's been so many opportunities to sanction these individuals before, after many previous acts of aggression by Putin that just haven't been acted on. Just thinking of the UK in particular, the poisoning of the Skripals, for example.
Well, I would argue that part of the reason that Putin had the guts to go into Ukraine and do what he was planning to do was because he looked at situations like the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and the invasion of Georgia and the annexation of Crimea, and he saw that there were no sanctions of any significance to him, and therefore didn't think there would be this time. The problem is with Putin is that once he makes a decision to do something, he doesn't have a reverse gear, and he has no ability to admit a mistake, and he has no ability to show weakness. And so we are kind of in a bind here because if the purpose of sanctions are to try to dissuade him from doing something, I think we're past that point. I think he's all in no matter what. In my mind, the purpose of sanctions are slightly different, which is that we're in a position right now where it may be Ukraine today, but if you look at his intentions and you look at what's being told to us by our allies in the Baltic countries and by President Zelensky, he's not stopping with Ukraine. He's got much broader ambitions. And so it should be our objective to do anything we can to choke off any resources that he may have to carry on with this war in Ukraine and to ultimately challenge us in a NATO border. And if that is our objective, and that has to be our objective, then of course we need to sanction these oligarchs. And if we don't do it, then we're going to be facing a much more difficult problem later on when we're facing Putin on a military level in a NATO conflict.
And some of these oligarchs. You've done business with them. I mean, how does it affect them to be sanctioned? I'd love to know sort of what does it mean once an oligarch is sanctioned? How does it affect them day to day? And in turn, how does that feed back to Putin and potentially influence his decisions?
Well, let's start with the second part of the question and then go to the first. These oligarchs are not just looking after their own money. The biggest oligarchs are looking after Putin's money. The next level oligarchs are looking after senior government officials' money, and so on and so forth. These are all people who are custodians, nominees, and trustees for Putin and his government. And the reason you want to sanction the oligarchs is because you want to sanction Putin. How does it affect his behavior? It means that he has less access to capital for whatever nefarious purposes he wants to use it for. And so it's truly important that everyone understands that this is not just, it's not like, some kind of, uh, you know, a populist exercise to go after rich people. It's an exercise to go after the most significant people who look after Putin's money and who are integral to the whole fabric of decision making in the Russian government. How does it affect them? It affects them profoundly because the moment you get put on a sanctions list, your money is frozen. It means that you can't use your money. It means that when they start running out of money from the frozen central bank reserves and they start running out of money because Western companies have stopped doing business in Russia, they don't have another source of money, which is their quote safe offshore capital. I've seen it with my own eyes. I know how these people behave. I know their psychology, and this is the most devastating thing that you can do to Vladimir Putin is sanction his oligarchs.
Right, that's so interesting. You talk about know their psychology because I sometimes, obviously, I don't feel sorry for oligarchs, but I sometimes wonder what it's like to be in such a precarious position, to be so wealthy, but to know that your position could change in a second, depending on a decision from perhaps a country that wants to sanction you, or a decision from Putin himself.
Well, it's a very good observation. So most of the time, if you come across somebody who's worth a few $1 billion, they're sort of brimming with self-confidence and happiness and ability to do anything and buy anything and have a good time. When you come across these Russians, they're very morose and aggressive, arrogant, but also fearful and distrusting. They're effectively acting at the pleasure of Vladimir Putin. At any moment, he can change their entire life circumstance. He can take their money away, he can take their freedom away, and can take their life away. And so it's a terrible, uncomfortable situation to be in. And now they're in an even worse situation because in order to kind of keep their money and be rich, they've had to do a deal with the devil. They might not, some of these people might not have been bad people to start out with, but they made a decision for money that they were going to throw their lot in with Vladimir Putin and look after his money, fund whatever he asks them to fund, act as custodians for friends of his, make investments on his behalf. And now they're in a position where they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, because the West is now saying, because you've thrown your lot in with Putin, we're going to have our ounce of flesh. And it's unfortunate for them, but these are not particularly nice people. And if you have any sympathy, you probably shouldn't.
Yes, understandably. And obviously, you've made it your life's work to campaign for human rights violators to have their assets frozen, to have visas blocked, etc. And I wonder, what are the arguments that you come up against from states that are reluctant to do this? You've mentioned the UK at the beginning of this interview being quite slow to act, even in this current crisis.
The arguments were different pre-invasion versus post-invasion. Back in the day, pre-invasion, both here and in Europe, you had all these people who were saying, we need to do business with Russia. Putin's not that bad. You don't want to provoke him. And it was particularly came from Germans and Swedes and all sorts of people who were Dutch, people who are very forthright now were being absolutely impossible before. And it was infuriating for me to be dealing with them. I mean, I knew Putin's criminal side from many years ago, and I watched him in action, and all these people sort of ignoring the elephant in the room, and I guess a sort of combination of wanting to carry on feeding at the Russian trough financially, along with some weird form of appeasement where everybody was saying that, or thinking they don't want to do anything to inflame Vladimir Putin. It's kind of like a battered wife with a violent husband, not just tiptoeing around, not wanting to wake him when he's drunk in case he beats them up. That's how everyone was dealing with Vladimir Putin. After the invasion, you still have people saying, "Okay, we've sanctioned him. Maybe we've done enough. We don't want to provoke him to a nuclear war." Well, if that is the feeling, and he kind of knows that's the feeling, then he will continue to threaten a nuclear war until he takes all of Eastern Europe. That is, Vladimir Putin knows that he doesn't have a strong hand other than his one big trump card, which is his ability to threaten nuclear war.
Yeah, and were you surprised then that Putin made this move? I mean, you said you've known his criminal side for years. I mean, you've been described as his number one enemy. You're probably his number one foreign enemy
Foreign
at the
enemy. I
moment.
mean,
Yeah,
Zelensky is clearly his number one enemy, and he's already sent 3 death squads unsuccessfully to kill him.
yeah.
Um, well, I am totally surprised because this is so the pattern of behavior for the last 22 years was to keep one foot in the civilized world and one foot in the criminal world. And so Vladimir Putin would be rubbing shoulders with other members of the G20, having summits, attending Council of Europe meetings, International Olympic Committee meetings, as sort of a legitimate head of a sovereign state. And then the other foot was in the criminal world where he was organizing assassination using polonium 210 nuclear compound in Grosvenor Square and Novichok, a banned chemical nerve agent um, in Salisbury, shooting down airplanes, assassinating other people all over the world, stealing money in tens of billions of dollars. And so I always thought that he kind of liked that sort of. I mean, and it was almost, you know, enjoyable for him to be, you know, watching how weak all the people were in the civilized world, accepting all this criminal behavior, and he spent years and years cultivating all sorts of people to come on board to, and all these people were sort of crowding around him, helping him, being on boards, apologizing for him, giving speeches. And so, and I thought he kind of enjoyed that and kind of wanted to carry on. And so, when people asked me, do I think he was going to invade? I thought he was just, this was a great way to just send a bunch of kids to the border, put them in a bunch of tents, make them freeze in the winter, and then get some concession from the West in terms of, a political concession. I couldn't have imagined that he would go full on criminal, both feet in the criminal camp. And this is a major shift. And in 24 hours, he lost the entire world. He became an international pariah. Even the president, the prime minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who has been his most loyal sort of Trojan horse inside the EU, has turned on him.
On that theme of all of these countries turning on him, were you surprised at the unity of the response, having sort of plugged away at this stuff for so many years?
Putin was making a bet, and I kind of thought that he was right, that when it came to the Ukraine invasion, we would behave the same way we did in all the other atrocities that he committed, which was, the Germans would, want their gas, and the Italians would want to sell their luxury goods
Yeah.
and all this type of stuff. What Putin hadn't really banked on, and I give great credit to the British government and the U.S. government, was they just leaked all the intelligence they had, and every day said Putin's going to invade, Putin's going to invade, Putin's going to invade. And when Putin tried to create some kind of weird story about how he was responding to some provocation, it was so obvious that it was a lie that everybody in the entire free world had to react to Putin launching a naked aggression with no provocation against a peaceful country. And there's no way you can respond to that other than having a tough economic response. So, I mean, the way it was handled by the U.S. and the U.K. was masterful and thoughtful, given how Putin had done it before.
That's really interesting. And actually, there have been reports that the war isn't going the way Putin necessarily planned it. And I know that, in your original guides as a hedge fund manager, you started fighting corruption in Russia and trying to get Russian companies to improve their corporate governance for business purposes, right? Before the death of your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. And you've dedicated your life to fighting injustice since then. But it didn't start out necessarily as an altruistic venture, because it's actually better for business, better for the Russian state, better for your investments if there was less corruption in the system. And I wonder if that corruption in the system now is manifesting in the war not going to Putin's plan.
It's an excellent question, and I think it defines everything perfectly. The military budget of Russia is equivalent to the military budget of the UK in terms of actual dollars spent. But from what my experience in Russia, the closer you get to state institutions, the more corruption there is. And for example, when I was there, Gazprom was trading at a 99.7% discount to BP and Exxon per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves, because so much stuff was being stolen. out of the company. And the same thing is true with the military. So they might have the same military budget, but everything is being stolen. And so when they're ready to launch an invasion, all the real assets were parked in bank accounts, and villas and yachts. And so everything wasn't working, and it's not working. And and it just continues to not work in all different ways. And so you have sort of an unmotivated staff because they're not being paid. The army. Uh, I'm sure all the equipment has been, all the spare parts have been sold for extra money. They probably sold the gas out of the tanks, and they're running out of gas. And every different way. I read an interesting story this morning about how Russia created their own mobile phone network because they were worried about eavesdropping using foreign ones, and it doesn't work. And so there was a general, a very important general named Gerasimov, who had to use a local SIM card, and the Ukrainians were able to identify him and assassinated him. It is a complete chaos, and they're losing that. According to Ukrainian estimates, the Russian military has already lost like 11,000 soldiers, and just an unbelievable number of tanks and armored personnel vehicles and planes and everything, because it's all just not how it's not a tip top ship shape military.
In that case, how do you see this ending, or at least the sort of current phase coming to an end? Can the West and other countries around the world who are opposing Putin's actions really stop this through economic measures alone?
There's a lot of different ways this thing can end. If we can completely strangle Putin's finances, he's going to run out of money. This is costing $1 billion or $2 billion a day to run this. He doesn't have the financial resources, with the money frozen at the central bank, with the SWIFT ban, the partial SWIFT ban, I should point out, and all the other sort of private sector boycotts. This is not going to, he's just not going to have enough money to do this. Since he's not in a mindset or has the psychology to reverse, the only thing we can do is to get him to stall out. And the Ukrainians are doing an admirable job of holding him back. And if they can hold him off for more days, more weeks, and we can strangle him economically, he's not going to have enough money to carry on and do all the things he's got planned.
Right.
That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is he does have the money. The atrocities escalate. In some way, he succeeds at Ukraine, and then he comes to the border of Estonia or Lithuania, and he points his guns, and he points his nukes, and then he says, "Okay, what do you guys want to do?" And then we have this big debate here in the UK and in the US, and we say, "Do we want to go to war to protect Estonia?" And he's hoping after this shameful capitulation in Afghanistan, where we left the country to the Taliban to protect 3,000 soldiers who weren't even in combat. He's hoping that we're going to say, you can have it, and then he'll have some big Yalta type negotiation where he takes all of everything after 1945 that the Soviet Union controlled, and that will be his new empire. That's our worst case scenario, and that's his best case scenario.
Right.
And there's one other scenario, which is a low probability, but not a no probability scenario, which is that the Ukrainians just keep on doing what they're doing, and at some point defeat the Russian invader. That make it just impossible. That they just take out so much military capacity that the Russians have no choice but to retreat. I say low probability scenario. That's the best case scenario for us.
Yeah, of course. And if you don't mind, just one last question. The UK government has obviously been under quite a lot of scrutiny for the amount of illicit Russian finance that comes through London, and also the links between some powerful Russians and the Conservative Party. I just wonder, what more should the UK government be doing, or is it a lost cause under a government like this?
They have every ability and capacity to do the right thing. I think that whatever influence the Russians may have had in the past, it's so de minimis compared to the existential risk that we're facing right now that they intend to, and they will do a lot more. It's frustrating watching the sort of fits and starts as this as this anti-Putin policy gets rolled out. But I mean, the downside of not doing it is just so dramatic that I think it will be done this time around.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bill Browder. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.